we release.
We are good to go, it looks like. Hang on one second.
Great. Yeah, it looks good on my end.
Okay, wonderful. So, welcome. My name is Jeff Greenberg. I am a senior advisor on election administration with the Committee of 70, and I am pleased to be able to introduce our guest for this version of our Studio C70. Michael Morse is an assistant professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania's Carey Law School. He studies voting rights, election administration, and the criminal justice system. His work combines empirical methods and novel administrative data with traditional legal scholarship, and he also has a secondary appointment in the political science department. Anything else you would like to add to introduce yourself to our viewers today?
No, that sounds great. Very happy to be in Philadelphia.
Thank you so much, and a pleasure to meet you. Let's talk a little bit about voter registration in general in Pennsylvania. I guess we could talk about some of the areas about like the process about how Pennsylvania's system is set up to allow folks to register, the deadlines, the fact that we have closed primaries, things of that nature. Let's focus on some of those issues first, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about the system itself.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that can often get overlooked when we talk about elections is just the importance of these voter registration requirements, right? A lot of people don't tune into an election until maybe the day of, the day, 2 days before, and suddenly see, you need to be registered to vote. A lot of people also move all of the time, right? And again, could run into problems. So one of the typical features of election day is you go check in to vote and you see a poll book. And I think it will be interesting to talk about kind of the ways in which that poll book influences both participation, who is eligible, but also how we talk about politics, right? We've often been hearing things about the accuracy of our list. We hear claims about fraud of our list. And so these lists are compiled before the election, right? Typically before the election. State law can vary. We often don't pay much attention to them. And I think actually that these lists actually matter a lot for understanding our politics. So I think this conversation could go in a number of ways. We could talk specifically about how Pennsylvania operates their poll books or the general problems of voter registration, how hard it is mainly for election officials to compile these accurate and complete voter registration lists.
Yeah, no, I think either any of those directions are good. I think you touched on the one point, which is the fact that society is so transient and how difficult it is to maintain an accurate list of voters, number one, because of that part. But there's also an aspect maybe you can touch on a little bit is that there are specific restrictions based on federal law on when Pennsylvania election officials can actually remove a voter from the voter rolls, which also sometimes lends itself to those allegations of inaccurate voter rolls. So maybe you can touch upon that a little bit.
Totally. So I think election officials have a really hard task here. And I think it's easy not to fully appreciate how hard the task is, right? I think the goal, as we're saying, is to have a list that is accurate and a list that's complete, right? And a list that is accurate would mean that the people registered to vote live at that address, that they still reside there, right? That they haven't passed away, something like that, and that they're still eligible to vote. And in some states, if you are convicted of you've had certain criminal convictions, you may not be eligible to vote. So I think in general, most people go about their lives and never talk to an election official until it's election day. So they move, no one's told an election official about that. And
Right.
so the lists don't update themselves. Even though Google knows everything about us, Amazon knows everything about us, the election officials don't. And so election officials are in this position that they need to go out and try to seek information. Who moved? Who died? Who is not eligible to vote? And maybe even who isn't on the rolls, but they are eligible. We would like to reach out to them so that we can register them to vote. That's actually a much harder task than we realize. And so I think the result is that sometimes our lists are necessarily inaccurate because we live in a dynamic world and the lists are very static. And I think what you're saying is federal law really restricts what election officials can do. So there's periods of time where election officials cannot remove anyone from the list. And in that time, of course, the list both could potentially grow a little bit inaccurate, but it's really to prevent error where we remove someone incorrectly in advance of an election. So we always have to weigh procedural protections for voters to guard against disenfranchisement with the value also of having accurate and complete lists. So I think the more I've gotten into this topic, the more I've realized how hard of a task it is for an election official, particularly a local election official, right?
And
People are
I,
moving across counties and across states.
yeah, as someone who was an election official for 13 years, I can absolutely affirm the difficulty of that process and of keeping those lists as accurate as possible. And I think that's one of the key messages in my mind is hopefully trying to get folks to understand that that is ultimately the goal of every election official. But those lists will never be and can never be 100% accurate because, as you noted, they literally change from second to second. And so if I want to see the voter list in my county at this moment, the moment I request it, it has literally changed the second they start to hit the print button. It's already changing. And so again, it's a difficult process.
Totally. I mean, I think I completely agree with you. It's one thing that makes it frustrating to hear some claims about our politics, right? Because once you understand that the lists are generated by our local lists, but people move across counties and states, that they're dynamic, and then you say, well, right, so the list will always be necessarily a little inaccurate. That doesn't mean there's fraud at all, but it
Yep.
does make it easy to point to and say, that looks weird, that looks wrong, and claim fraud, but with no evidence. But
Right.
our lists will always have that dimension to them. And I think that's really been abused in the last few years. That's become a whole avenue of a claim to kind of delegitimize elections work. And it's really not anything to do with elections officials so much as federalism, right? Like the structure of our system.
Yeah, I agree. Now, some of these questions we're going to get into now reference something that you wrote. So maybe you can give us just a brief overview of, I believe it was entitled Democracy's Bureaucracy, the Complicated Case of Voter Registration Lists. Could you give us just a quick overview of what the focus of that writing was?
Yeah. So I recently wrote this article, you're right, it's called Democracy's Bureaucracy. And Democracy's Bureaucracy is about when I started the project, a relatively unknown organization. At this point, somewhat more, you may have seen a news story about them. It is about this group called the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC. And in the last few months, there has been more news stories about ERIC, but I got interested in ERIC because I thought they played this really interesting and underappreciated role. So the way we're talking about our elections, right? We typically say our elections are local, or maybe there are some elements run by the state, but certainly we see them as state and local affairs, not federal affairs, right? The federal government's not involved. There's no federal voter registration list. And Eric plays this really interesting coordinating function to allow the states, they do a lot of things, but one thing is they allow the states to coordinate with each other. And so it is a group composed of the chief state election officials. So Pennsylvania is a member of ERIC, as are about 20 plus other states. And through ERIC, they can share data. And the really key part of what ERIC does is, remember at the start of this conversation, we've been talking about how people move all the time, but no one tells the election official. Well, Eric is kind of helping election officials on the back end piece it all together, figuring it out through data. Oh, this person moved from Pennsylvania to New Jersey. I see them on the rolls there, or things like that. And so what the article does is, the first part of the article tries to explain kind of our complicated federal, state, and local structure for voter registration and for keeping the list accurate. That's called list maintenance. Part two is really this deep dive into ERIC, how it operates, how it works, kind of the really complicated laws that it has to navigate, particularly privacy laws. And part three, it really turns to thinking about elements about how ERIC is vulnerable, how it's been the subject of attacks, and how outside groups have been able to kind of almost engineer claims about fraud based on our lists. And so I think the whole article is trying to tell us that our list maintenance matters. These lists are the backbone of our elections, and we need to spend more time thinking about kind of our policies around them.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think, part of the discussion surrounding Eric, at least those that I've seen nationally, and I'd just be curious to get your opinion on this. It doesn't feel that there is a lot, even though there are states that have left Eric in the last year, a decent number. It doesn't appear that there is criticism of Eric surrounding the ability that it offers states to share information and to actually try to keep the voter list accurate. It appears that some of the objections are centered on the other side or part of Eric, which attempts to help register eligible but unregistered citizens in those states. And sadly, that seems to have overwhelmed the benefit of the voter list maintenance side of it. And there really is, to me, there is those two things go hand in hand. They really help each other. And sadly, it hasn't been portrayed that way.
Yeah, I completely agree. Those two things do go hand in hand. And I think we've just seen like a really quick shift in our politics. And Eric has become a target, but not for particularly legitimate reasons. Because I think one of the things about this area is, when we talk about list maintenance, it's easy in our heads to say, I've never heard that term. I've heard the word purging, right?
Mm.
And then you think that this issue maps easily onto our familiar, right, kind of access integrity debate, or the left and the right debate. And I think the more we think about it, I think an election officials, I think, agree with this. I'm curious for what you would think, that list maintenance actually serves everyone's goals, meaning a more accurate list is both key to access, right? Because if you show up at the polls where you used to live there, or you show up at your new poll, but you didn't transfer your address from the other county, you're going to potentially have an access problem. You may be able to still vote, depends on the state we're in. And of course, more inaccurate lists feed this narrative. It's not connected to fraud, but it feeds a narrative of dirty lists.
Yep.
And in that sense, more accurate lists are key for everyone. And so withdrawing from these types of organizations, it is hard to come up with a genuine reason why you've seen so many people withdraw. I think that said, we can still think about ways to improve the organization and make it better for people who are in it. But yes, it's been very unfortunate.
So you touched upon this briefly. Maybe you can dig in a little bit deeper. The article mentions the concept vigilante list maintenance by private interest groups, and we've seen that in some large numbers in other states, but also in Allegheny County recently in Pennsylvania. Can you elaborate on how these groups use administrative records to potentially influence partisan narratives about voter fraud?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what is the common tactic now is that you take publicly available information, right? So you take a list of registered voters, the public list, which doesn't have all the information that the non-public list has. And then you try to match that list by looking up those people by their name and whatever other information you have, maybe the year that they're born or other things, to other lists. Those other lists are other either administrative or commercial lists that track people's activity. So it could be people who are on the rolls in another state, right? Compare Pennsylvania's list with another state's list. Compare Pennsylvania's list with a commercial list, with other things. Now, the reality is that our public lists don't have enough information on them to actually reliably identify an individual across lists. So you can find someone with the same name. Maybe they're born in the same year. Maybe they're the same person, but maybe they're not. It gets very hard using public data to conduct this audit of the list. In fact, one of the only real way to do it is confidential data. Now, that data is held by elections officials, by the state, and is shared with Eric. So Eric has access to it in a secure way. Confidential data can let you find inaccuracies and correct them. But the vigilante idea is they don't have access to confidential data. They're not the government. They're private groups. So what they do is it's so easy. They download public data, they run a check against it, kind of usually a haphazard one, and then they present evidence of fraud, and it's pseudoscientific, but it's very easy to generate. And so I think you're just seeing it again and again and again. And I think in 2024, it's going to be used to challenge individual people at the polls. So I think you're just seeing a real trade-off here. Confidential data, more accurate data, but less transparent, right? We have to be careful with it. Public data, yes, lots of accessibility, but not meant for what they're using it for. And I think hopefully that framework kind of gives a little context because we're going to keep seeing these claims again and again, right? All these people cast 2 votes. Well, when you really look at it, do they have the data to make that claim? And the almost answer always is no.
And our last question for this afternoon, another part of your article offers policy solutions to fortify list maintenance and promote enfranchisement of voters. Can you perhaps outline some of those proposed solutions and how they address the challenges identified in the article?
Yeah, so I am maybe not by myself, but with a few others, I'm really hoping to put the ideas of some policy reforms on the table here. And so the general law that we should be talking about here is the NVRA, right? The NVRA is a federal law that regulates the list maintenance process. So it tells election officials what the rules are for list maintenance. And basically, the way I would understand the NVRA is it has a series of procedural protections for voters to make sure that voters aren't removed wrongly and then unable to vote, right? We have protections against that. But it has no substantive standard in the NVRA for what makes good list maintenance. So you see elections officials do all sorts of things. You could send someone a piece of mail and say, do you still live here? You could match your data to other data from another state, like through Eric. You could match it to the post office data, the NCOA list. But we don't regulate the quality at all of the match. We instead say, no matter what you did, you can't remove someone unless they tell you in writing they moved, they confirmed it, or you wait 2 federal general elections. And I think there are better ways to do this. I would like to incentivize people to use higher quality data with stricter standards, pushing people towards Eric or things like Eric. But if we are more confident in the match, if we're more confident in our data, we can allow the process to go faster. We can speed up the process, which may, of course, we're trying to strike a bargain here. We're trying to get more people on board with this. One of the things that's very frustrating to me, and I think could be a real reform, is we're often stuck in this world where our county lines become really important for our laws, even though for our everyday lives, they're less important. So imagine someone moves from county A to B, and they were registered in A, but not yet in B. Often county A has to work hard to find that person, to send them a mailer. They don't respond to the mailer because they don't live there anymore. It takes years. The whole time they're sitting in B, but they're not on the rolls yet. What I think is the move that we should be interested in is what we call transfers. A registration transfer gets that person off the rolls in A and on the rolls in B. And by getting them from the rolls in A to B, we don't have to wait 2 federal general elections to fix the list in A. If you can get them on the rolls in the right place, if we can incentivize access, then we can also encourage accuracy. And so I think I'm trying to think of policies and ideas where we are rewarding coordination and transfers because ultimately voters move, but we have local election and administration. That's the fundamental tension. And I think this is the area that I would love people who are interested in both increasing access, who are concerned about kind of current claims about fraud, thinking about something that is deeply, in some sense, boring and bureaucratic. But I think behind it all, it kind of has these structural ramifications. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about, what I was proposing in the article. It is not what you see on the front pages about how to reform our elections. And that's not to say those things aren't important. They're also important. But it's trying to put some other way of thinking, a more bureaucratic way of thinking, that I hope adds something to it, or at least a perspective about how our elections work.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation for me today. So right up my alley. I love digging into the weeds of election administration. So we appreciate your time, Professor, and look forward to hopefully engaging down the road with you as well as far as election issues go. And thank you once again for your time today.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much for hosting this.
Thank
Talk to
you.
you later.